The first German patrol reached the bridge at 0517. Staff Sergeant Leonard Lenny Kowalczyk watched them through the pre-dawn mist. 6 soldiers moving cautiously along the riverbank, their rifles ready, their eyes scanning the far shore. They had no idea he was there. They had no idea that the American defensive position they were probing consisted of exactly one man. And Kowalczyk intended to keep it that way. It was December 18th, 1944, the Ardennes, 3 days into what history would remember as the Battle of the Bulge, and the American lines were in chaos. German panzer divisions had punched through the front, scattering units, overrunning positions, driving toward the Meuse River with a speed that nobody had thought possible. The attack had come out of nowhere. American intelligence had missed the buildup entirely. 250,000 German soldiers massing in the forests, supported by over 1,000 tanks and assault guns. When they struck on December 16th, the thin American line had shattered like glass. Kowalczyk's company had been caught in the initial breakthrough. One moment they were in reserve, warming themselves around fires and complaining about the cold Belgian weather. The Christmas packages had started arriving, and the men were talking about what they would do when the war ended. Victory seemed certain. It was just a matter of time. The next moment, German tanks were rolling through the forest, and Captain Morrison was screaming orders that nobody could hear over the sound of the artillery. The bombardment had been devastating. German 80s and heavy mortars pounding American positions with a precision that spoke of careful preparation. The first shells had caught the company in the open, killing a dozen men before anyone could react. The company had scattered. Some men fled west, toward what they hoped were friendly lines, stumbling through the snow in a blind panic. Others were captured, emerging from foxholes with their hands raised as German infantry swept through their positions. A few stood and fought, dying in place rather than run, their bodies left frozen in the snow. Kowalczyk had done none of these things. He had grabbed his BAR, his ammunition, and as many grenades as he could carry, and he had headed north, toward the bridge. He didn't know why exactly. Instinct, maybe, or training, or the memory of something Captain Morrison had said. The bridge over the Somme River wasn't much. A stone span perhaps 40 feet long, wide enough for a single vehicle, maybe 2 if the drivers were careful. Ancient stonework, probably medieval, patched and repaired over centuries until it was more repairs than original material. In peacetime, it had carried farm carts and the occasional automobile. Now it was a choke point, one of the few crossings in this sector that could support the weight of German armor. In peacetime, it had carried farm carts and the occasional automobile. Now it was a choke point, one of the few crossings in this sector that could support the weight of German armor. If the Germans took the bridge intact, they could push their tanks across the river and into the rear areas where American supply columns and artillery units were trying to reorganize. If the bridge was held or destroyed, they would have to find another crossing, buying time for the American defenses to solidify. Captain Morrison had mentioned the bridge once, 3 days ago, in a briefing that now seemed to belong to another lifetime. Somebody should be watching that crossing, he had said. If things go bad, that's where they'll come. Things had gone bad, and now somebody was watching the crossing. Kowalczyk was 31 years old, a former steelworker from Pittsburgh who had joined the army in 1942 because the mills were laying off men and the war was hiring. He had grown up in the shadow of the furnaces, had worked the night shifts since he was 17, had breathed the smoke and fire until it felt like home. The army had seemed like an escape. 3 square meals, a paycheck, the chance to see the world. He hadn't thought much about the fighting, not until North Africa, when a German machine gun had killed the 3 men next to him and left him the only survivor of his squad. After that, he had thought about the fighting plenty. He had been wounded twice, once in Sicily when an artillery shell had landed close enough to fill his legs with shrapnel, once in Normandy when a German sniper had put a bullet through his shoulder. Both times he had returned to duty as soon as the doctors would let him, not out of heroism, but out of stubbornness. The same stubbornness that had kept him working the furnaces when smarter men would have quit. He had been promoted twice. Squad leader after Sicily, staff sergeant after Normandy. He had turned down a battlefield commission twice because officers had to make decisions that got men killed, and he wanted no part of that responsibility. Now he was alone on the north bank of the Somme River, watching a German patrol approach the bridge, and the only responsibility he had was to himself. The patrol stopped at the near end of the bridge. The lead soldier, an NCO, judging by his bearing and the way the others deferred to him, studied the far bank through binoculars. Kowalczyk pressed himself deeper into the foxhole he had dug during the night, barely breathing, willing himself to be invisible. He had spent hours digging that foxhole. The ground was frozen, hard as concrete, and his entrenching tool had rung against the earth with every stroke. But a deep foxhole was worth more than body armor. The old sergeant in Sicily had taught him that, and he had kept digging until he had a hole deep enough to survive anything but a direct hit. The NCO lowered his binoculars, said something to his men in German, started across the bridge. Kowalczyk let them come. He let them reach the midpoint of the span, where they were exposed on all sides, with no cover and nowhere to run. Then he opened fire. The bar roared in the morning silence. 3 Germans went down in the first burst, their bodies crumpling on the ancient stones. The other 3 tried to run, back toward the near bank, toward safety, but Kowalczyk tracked them with the automatic rifle, firing controlled bursts that echoed off the river valley like thunder. 6 shots, 6 bodies on the bridge. Kowalczyk changed magazines and waited. He didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, he could hear shouting from the German side, officers barking orders, men scrambling into position. They would probe again, more carefully this time, trying to determine what they were facing. Kowalczyk had already thought about this. He had spent the night preparing, and he intended to give the Germans exactly what they expected. What they expected was an American defensive position, a squad at least, maybe a platoon, multiple firing positions, overlapping fields of fire, the standard infantry deployment for defending a choke point. What they were going to get was one man who knew how to make himself look like a battalion. The second probe came 20 minutes later. This time it was a full squad, 12 men moving in rushes, using the terrain for cover. They had learned from the first patrol's mistakes. No one walked casually across the bridge now. They came forward in bounds, fire, and movement, the way infantry was supposed to advance against a defended position. They had a machine gun team setting up on the far bank, an MG-42, the Hitler's buzzsaw that could fire 1,200 rounds per minute. 2 men were positioning the weapon behind a stone wall, while a third laid out ammunition belts. Kowalczyk could see an officer with binoculars observing from a stand of trees, directing the assault with hand signals. They were taking him seriously. Good. Kowalczyk had prepared 3 firing positions during the night. The primary was the foxhole overlooking the bridge, deep enough to provide real protection, with good sight lines to the crossing and a low profile that would be almost invisible from the far bank. The secondary was 50 yards to the east, behind a fallen tree, covering the upstream approach where the river narrowed enough that a determined man might try to cross. The tertiary was 50 yards west in a shell crater that offered a different angle on the bridge and a quick route to the tree line if he needed to retreat. He had connected the positions with shallow crawl trenches, scraping the frozen earth with his entrenching tool until his hands bled. A man in one position could reach another in 30 seconds without exposing himself to fire. And he had prepared something else. 4 piles of ammunition, scattered across the defensive line, each one topped with a grenade that could be triggered by a tripwire. When the grenades went off, they would throw ammunition in all directions, creating the sound and flash of multiple weapons firing from multiple positions. It was a trick he had learned in Sicily from an old sergeant named Kowalski, no relation, despite the similar name. The sergeant had fought in the First War, had spent 4 years in the trenches, had learned things about deception that they didn't teach in any manual. One man can't hold a position, the sergeant had said, but one man can make the enemy think he's facing a company. The German sees a muzzle flash here, hears a grenade there, takes fire from 3 directions. He doesn't count rifles. He counts threats. Make enough threats, and he'll think you're a battalion. And if he figures it out? The sergeant had shrugged. Then you die. But you die anyway, probably. Might as well make it interesting. Kowalczyk intended to test that theory. The German squad began its assault. They came forward in bounds, fire and movement, covering each other as they advanced toward the bridge. The machine gun on the far bank opened up, spraying the American side with suppressive fire. Kowalczyk let them get close, let them think they had the upper hand, let them commit to the attack. Then he triggered the first decoy. The grenade went off with a sharp crack, and suddenly ammunition was cooking off 50 yards to his left. The sound of a second weapon, a second position, a second American soldier firing on the attackers. The Germans hesitated. uncertain where the new threat was coming from. Kowalczyk used their hesitation. He popped up from his foxhole and fired a burst into the assault team, dropping 2 men. Then he rolled out of the position, crawled to the secondary, and fired again from a completely different angle. To the Germans, it looked like they were taking fire from 3 positions. 3 American soldiers, at least, maybe more. The assault faltered. The survivors pulled back, dragging their wounded with them. The machine gun kept firing, but it was shooting at empty positions now, wasting ammunition on dirt and trees. Kowalczyk crawled back to his primary position and waited. The morning wore on. The Germans probed twice more, each time with more men, each time with more caution, and each time Kowalczyk gave them what they expected. Fire from multiple positions, explosions that suggested a defended line, the appearance of a force much larger than one exhausted sergeant with a Browning automatic rifle. He was burning through ammunition faster than he would have liked. The BAR ate 20-round magazines like candy, and his supply was finite. But every minute he held the bridge was a minute that the Germans couldn't use it, a minute for American units to regroup, a minute that might make the difference between defeat and survival. By noon, he had killed or wounded perhaps 30 Germans. The bodies were piling up on the bridge and along the approaches, testament to the cost of attacking a defended position. The German commander, whoever he was, had clearly decided that this crossing was not worth the price. But they hadn't given up. They were just waiting. Waiting for reinforcements. Waiting for artillery. Waiting for the firepower to overwhelm whatever American force was defending this insignificant stone bridge. Kowalczyk knew he couldn't hold forever. He was one man with one rifle and a dwindling supply of ammunition. Eventually, the Germans would bring up enough force to crush him, or they would call in mortars and blast his positions to rubble, or they would simply wait until darkness and slip across under cover of night. He had to make them believe that attacking was too costly, that the American defense was too strong, that the smart move was to find another crossing and leave this bridge alone. He had to make one man look like a battalion. The German officer arrived at 14:30. Kowalczyk saw him through the scope of a captured German rifle, a Hauptmann, judging by his insignia, accompanied by a radio operator and 2 NCOs. They had set up an observation post on a small rise overlooking the bridge, and the Hauptmann was studying the American positions through high-powered binoculars. Kowalczyk considered taking the shot. The range was perhaps 300 yards. Difficult, but not impossible for a skilled marksman. Kill the officer and the Germans would lose their command structure. But killing the officer might prompt exactly the response he was trying to avoid. A furious assault driven by anger rather than calculation. Overwhelming force thrown at the bridge regardless of the cost. Number. Better to let the officer observe. Better to let him see what he expected to see. A well-defended position, multiple soldiers, a hard target that wasn't worth the casualties. Kowalczyk triggered another decoy. The grenade went off in the western position, throwing sparks and debris. He fired a burst from his primary position, then crawled to the secondary and fired again, then back to the primary for another burst. To the officer watching through binoculars, it would look like a coordinated defense. Multiple soldiers, shifting positions, covering each other. A textbook infantry deployment. The Hauptmann lowered his binoculars, spoke to his radio operator. The radio operator began transmitting. Kowalczyk didn't know what the officer was saying, but he could guess. Strong American position, multiple defenders, recommend finding alternate crossing. That was the goal. That had been the goal from the beginning. Not to defeat the Germans. One man couldn't defeat a German battalion. But to convince them that this bridge wasn't worth the fight. The afternoon passed. More probes, more deception, more bodies on the bridge. Kowalczyk was exhausted now, running on adrenaline and stubbornness, his hands shaking from the cold and the constant firing. He had perhaps 3 magazines left for the bar, maybe 50 rounds for his pistol, 2 grenades that he was saving for the end. The cold was the worst part. Not the Germans, not the fear, not even the exhaustion. The cold. December in Belgium was bitter, the temperature hovering around 0, and Kowalczyk had been lying in frozen earth for 12 hours. His feet were numb. His fingers ached every time he pulled the trigger. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, stealing his strength, making every movement an act of will. He thought about the steel mills, the heat of the furnaces, the glow of molten metal, the warmth that had soaked into his skin on even the coldest Pittsburgh nights. He would give anything to feel that warmth now. But there was no warmth here, only the cold, and the Germans, and the bridge. The Germans were patient. They had learned that rushing the bridge meant death, and they weren't going to waste any more men on frontal assaults. Instead, they were waiting, probing occasionally, keeping him pinned down, wearing him out. Kowalczyk knew what they were waiting for: reinforcements, artillery, the firepower to overwhelm whatever American force was defending this insignificant stone bridge. When that firepower arrived, his defense would be over. The end came at 1647. He heard them before he saw them: the rumble of engines, the clatter of tracks, the distinctive sound of German armor on the move, tanks, panzers, moving up to support the infantry. Whatever Kowalczyk had done, whatever illusion he had created, the Germans had decided that enough was enough. He couldn't fight tanks. The bar was useless against armor. The .30-06 rounds would bounce off a Panzer IV like pebbles off a boulder. He had no bazookas, no anti-tank grenades, no mines, nothing that could stop a panzer. When those tanks reached the bridge, his defense would be over. Kowalczyk made his peace with it. He had held the bridge for 12 hours. He had killed or wounded perhaps 30 Germans. He had done everything one man could do, and more than anyone had a right to expect. If the tanks came, he would die, but he would die with the knowledge that he had made a difference. He checked his last magazine, 17 rounds, enough to take a few more with him. But the tanks didn't reach the bridge. The sound of the engines changed, grew fainter, moved away to the east, following some road he couldn't see, heading towards some other objective. The tanks were leaving, not attacking, but bypassing the bridge entirely. Kowalczyk didn't understand. He rose from his foxhole, scanning the far bank, trying to see what was happening. The German infantry was pulling back, loading onto half-tracks and trucks, moving out in an organized withdrawal. The Hauptmann and his observation team were gone. The machine gun positions were being abandoned. They were leaving. They were actually leaving. For a long moment, Kowalczyk just stood there, unable to believe what he was seeing. 12 hours of fighting, 12 hours of deception, 12 hours of pure, stubborn refusal to die, and the Germans were withdrawing. He sat down heavily in his foxhole. His legs wouldn't hold him anymore. The adrenaline was fading, and exhaustion was rushing in to fill the void. It wasn't until later that Kowalczyk learned what had happened. The German commander had reported to his superiors that the bridge was defended by at least a company of American infantry, dug in and prepared to fight. Taking the bridge would require a battalion-level assault, with tank support and artillery preparation. In the fast-moving chaos of the Ardennes offensive, no such force could be spared for a single stone bridge. The Germans had found another crossing, 5 miles to the east. They had pushed their armor across there instead, leaving the Somme River Bridge in American hands. One man had held the bridge for 12 hours. One man had convinced an entire German battle group that they were facing a battalion. One man had bought enough time for the American lines to stabilize, for reinforcements to arrive, for the tide of the battle to begin its slow turn. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month. American casualties would exceed 80,000, the largest single battle the U.S. Army fought in World War II. But the German offensive would fail, stopped not by a single decisive blow, but by 1,000 small actions like the defense of the Somme River Bridge. Bridges held, crossroads defended, choke points blocked. 100 men like Kowalczyk scattered across the Ardennes, buying time with their blood and their stubbornness. The German high command had gambled everything on this offensive. They had stripped other fronts, committed their last reserves, bet the future of the Reich on a single blow that would split the Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. When that gamble failed, when the tanks ran out of fuel, when the American lines held, when the weather cleared and Allied aircraft returned to the skies, the war was effectively over. The soldiers who held the line in December 1944 didn't know they were winning the war. They only knew that they were cold and scared and very far from home. They only knew that the Germans kept coming, and somebody had to stop them. Kowalczyk never claimed to be a hero, never claimed to have done anything special. He had held a bridge because somebody had to, and he had been there. That was all. But that was enough. In the chaos of the Bulge, in the desperate hours when the American army was reeling and the German tanks were rolling forward, that was enough. The relief column found Kowalczyk at dusk, a platoon from the 82nd Airborne, pushing forward to establish a new defensive line, had been told that the bridge might be in German hands. They approached cautiously, weapons ready, expecting a fight. The paratroopers moved through the tree line like ghosts, their experience in Normandy and Holland evident in every step. Lieutenant Collins, the platoon leader, had seen the German withdrawal through binoculars. He had watched the tanks and infantry move east, abandoning the bridge, and he had wondered what the hell could have stopped them. A company of infantry? A battalion? Some secret weapon that the brass hadn't told him about? Instead, they found one man sitting on the north bank, his bar across his knees, surrounded by empty magazines and the scattered debris of 12 hours of combat. Kowalczyk didn't even raise his weapon when the paratroopers emerged from the tree line. He just looked at them with eyes that had seen too much, done too much, survived too much. "American," he said. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Staff Sergeant Kowalczyk, 422nd Infantry." Collins moved forward slowly, his men spreading out to secure the position. The lieutenant stared at the bridge, at the bodies still lying on the stones, frozen now in the December cold, at the single soldier who had held this position against everything the Germans had thrown at him. "How many men do you have?" Collins asked. Kowalczyk looked at him. His eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion, his face blackened with powder residue, his hands still trembling from the hours of firing. Ice had formed in his eyebrows, and his lips were cracked and bleeding from the cold. "Just me, sir. Just you." "Yes, sir. Just me." Collins was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the German dead, tried to count them, gave up somewhere around 25. There were more on the far bank, he knew. He had seen them through his binoculars before the Germans withdrew, more in the tree line, where the casualties from the later assaults had been dragged. "The Germans reported a company here, maybe a battalion. They said you had machine guns, mortars, the whole works." Kowalczyk almost smiled. Almost. But his face was too frozen, too exhausted to manage the expression. "I moved around a lot, sir, made some noise, tried to look like more than I was." "You held this bridge for 12 hours, alone, against a German battle group." "Yes, sir." "Why?" The question seemed to puzzle Kowalczyk. He thought about it for a moment, turning it over in his mind like something foreign and strange. "Because somebody had to, sir, and I was here." Collins didn't know what to say to that. He had led men in combat since Normandy, had seen heroism and cowardice and everything in between, but he had never seen anything like this. One man, holding a bridge against an army, because somebody had to, and he was here. He turned to his radio man. "Get me battalion. Tell them the bridge is secure. One friendly, multiple enemy KIA." He paused. "And tell them to send a medic. This man needs attention." Kowalczyk shook his head weakly. "I'm fine, sir." "You're not fine, Sergeant. You're half frozen and running on fumes. Let the medic look at you." "Yes, sir." The paratroopers began to set up defensive positions, taking over the work that Kowalczyk had done alone for 12 hours. The medic arrived and began checking the sergeant for frostbite, for wounds, for the dozen small injuries that a man accumulated in 12 hours of combat. And Leonard Kowalczyk, Staff Sergeant, 422nd Infantry Regiment, finally allowed himself to close his eyes. The Army awarded Kowalczyk the Distinguished Service Cross for his defense of the Salm River Bridge. The citation mentioned extraordinary heroism and exceptional tactical skill and complete disregard for personal safety in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. It didn't mention the decoys. It didn't mention the tricks he had learned in Sicily, the grenades rigged to simulate multiple positions, the constant movement that had made one man look like a company. It didn't mention the 12 hours of fear that he had controlled through sheer force of will, the moments when he had been certain the Germans would call his bluff, the exhaustion that had nearly overwhelmed him a dozen times. Citations never mentioned things like that. Kowalczyk returned to his unit, which had reformed from the scattered survivors of the initial breakthrough. He fought through the rest of the Bulge, through the crossing of the Rhine, through the final drive into Germany. He was wounded for the third time at Remagen, took a piece of shrapnel in the hip that left him with a permanent limp. When the war ended, he went home to Pittsburgh. The city hadn't changed. The furnaces still glowed against the night sky. The smoke still hung in the valleys. The mills still roared with the sound of molten steel. It was like stepping back in time, back to a world where the war had never happened, where the bridge over the Somme River was just another forgettable location on a map he would never see again. He went back to the steel mills, which were hiring again, now that the war economy had shifted to peacetime production. The work was the same as before, hot, dangerous, exhausting, but it was honest work, and it paid enough to support a family. He married a Polish girl from his neighborhood, a woman named Helena, who had waited for him through 4 years of war. She had written him every week, letters that arrived in bunches and smelled of the perfume she wore. She had prayed for him every night, lit candles at St. Stanislaus, bargained with God for his safe return. She never asked about the war. Some wives did. They wanted to know what their husbands had done, what they had seen, what they had survived. Helena never asked. She understood somehow that some things were better left in the past. They had 6 children, one after another, filling their small row house with noise and chaos and life. Kowalczyk worked double shifts to pay for shoes and clothes and food, came home exhausted every night, fell asleep in his chair with a child on his lap. It was a good life, a simple life, the life he had dreamed of during the long nights on the Somme River, when death had seemed certain and the future had seemed impossible. He worked the mills until his hip gave out in 1972, the same hip that had taken shrapnel at Remagen, that had never quite healed right, that finally surrendered after 30 years of standing on concrete floors. The company put him on disability, and he spent his remaining years on the porch of the row house, watching his grandchildren play in the street. He never talked about the bridge. When people asked about his service, and people always asked once they saw the medals in their case on the mantel, he would shrug and change the subject. What was there to say? He had done what needed to be done, the same as a million other soldiers, in a million other places. The bridge was just a bridge. The 12 hours were just 12 hours. But sometimes, late at night, when Helena was asleep and the house was quiet, he would think about that morning on the Somme River, the mist rising from the water, the first German patrol crossing the bridge, the moment when he had opened fire and committed himself to a defense that should have been impossible. He had been afraid. Terrified, really. Every minute of those 12 hours, he had expected to die, expected the Germans to see through his deception, expected a mortar round to find his position, expected the end to come at any moment. But he had kept fighting, had kept moving, had kept making noise and creating illusions, and convincing the enemy that one man was a battalion. Fear is worth more than bullets. That's what the old sergeant had told him in Sicily, and the old sergeant had been right. The Germans had feared what they thought was waiting for them on the north bank of the Somme. They had feared the machine guns and the mortars and the company of infantry that existed only in their imagination. They had feared enough to leave the bridge alone, to find another crossing, to bypass the one man who had created that fear from nothing but stubbornness and guile. He thought about that sometimes, during the long, quiet evenings on the porch. Thought about the German Hauptmann who had studied his positions through binoculars, who had reported a battalion where there was only one tired sergeant. Thought about the tank commander who had turned his panzers east rather than cross a bridge defended by ghosts. What had they seen? What had they believed? What story had they told themselves about the Americans on the north bank? He would never know. The Germans who had attacked his position were dead or captured or scattered to the winds. Their reports, if they still existed, were buried in some archive in Berlin or Moscow. The Hauptmann was probably dead, killed in the weeks of fighting that followed, one more casualty in a war that had produced millions. But Kowalczyk remembered. He remembered every trick, every deception, every desperate gamble that had made one man look like 100. He remembered the fear in his gut and the ice in his bones, and the absolute certainty that he was going to die on that bridge. And he remembered the moment when the tanks had turned away, the moment when the Germans had withdrawn, the moment when he had realized, against all odds, that he was going to survive. That memory stayed with him until the end. The memory of winning a battle, not with bullets, but with fear. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes fear was the weapon that won the battle. Leonard Kowalczyk died in 1998 at the age of 85. He was buried in St. Stanislaus Cemetery in Pittsburgh with full military honors, his Distinguished Service Cross placed in his hands before the casket was closed. The obituary in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette mentioned his service in World War II, his decoration for valor, his 50 years in the steel mills. It mentioned his wife and his children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren. It didn't mention the bridge. It didn't mention the 12 hours alone on the Somme River. It didn't mention the moment when one man had looked at an impossible situation and decided to fight anyway. Obituaries never mention things like that, but the men who served with him remembered. The paratroopers who had found him at dusk remembered, and the story passed from soldier to soldier, from veteran to veteran, until it became one of those legends that every Army infantryman knows, the story of the sergeant who held a bridge alone and made the Germans think they were fighting a battalion. Today, if you visit the Ardennes, you can still find the bridge over the Somme River. It's been rebuilt since the war. The original stones were damaged by shell fire, cracked by the cold, worn by the years, but it stands in the same place, spanning the same water, carrying the same traffic. The valley is peaceful now. Farmers work the fields that were once battlegrounds. Tourists visit the memorials and museums, trying to understand what happened here in the winter of 1944. Children play in meadows where men once died. There is no plaque at the bridge, no monument, no indication that anything significant ever happened there. The Belgian government has commemorated dozens of battle sites in the Ardennes, but this bridge, this insignificant stone crossing over a small river, was never deemed worthy of official recognition. Perhaps that's appropriate. The men who fought the Battle of the Bulge were not fighting for monuments. They were fighting to survive, to hold the line, to buy time for the reinforcements that might turn the tide. They were fighting because somebody had to, and they were there. But if you stand on the north bank in the early morning when the mist is rising from the river, you can almost see him, a lone figure in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the far shore, waiting for the enemy to come. A steelworker from Pittsburgh who had never wanted to lead men, who had never wanted responsibility, who had simply found himself alone at a bridge that had to be held. And held it he did, for 12 hours, against everything the Germans could throw at him. One man, one bridge, 12 hours. And the Germans never knew. They never knew that the battalion they feared was a single soldier with a Browning automatic rifle. They never knew that the machine guns existed only in their imagination. They never knew that every position they saw, every weapon they heard, was one exhausted sergeant moving from foxhole to foxhole, creating the illusion of strength from nothing but courage and desperation. They reported a company, maybe a battalion. They reported a well-defended position that would require significant force to overcome. And because of that report, they found another crossing. They left the bridge alone. They gave the Americans the time they needed to regroup and counterattack. One man, one bridge, one lie that saved a battle. Sometimes the greatest victories are won, not with overwhelming force, but with overwhelming audacity. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the gun in your hands, but the fear in your enemy's mind. Staff Sergeant Leonard Kowalczyk understood that. He understood it on the morning of December 18th, 1944, when he looked at a German battle group and decided to make them afraid. He had no delusions about what he was doing. He was one man with one rifle against an army. The odds were impossible. The outcome was almost certain. But he had learned something in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, in the furnaces where men worked in conditions that would kill anyone who didn't respect the fire. He had learned that sometimes the impossible was just the improbable, and the improbable sometimes happened if you were stubborn enough to try. So he had tried. He had dug his foxholes and set his decoys and created the illusion of a battalion from nothing but courage and cleverness. He had made the Germans believe they were facing a force that didn't exist. And for 12 hours, on a stone bridge over the Somme River, he made one man look like a battalion. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. These stories of individual courage deserve to be remembered and shared. Drop a comment below. Could you have held that bridge 12 hours alone with an entire German battle group trying to take it? And if you haven't already, check out our previous video on the Battle of the Bulge, the larger context for this incredible story of one sergeant's desperate defense. Until next time.